All right, as you saw, Chairman Schiff there say they're going to take a break now because they're still legislating that needs to go on. There's votes that need to happen. So the guests are now leaving, the witnesses, pardon me. So that is David Holmes, who is a Foreign Service officer, a career diplomat. Also, that is Dr. Fiona Holmes, who is a Russia expert. They made pretty powerful statements and have been questioned, as you saw, by the Democrats. They will follow up with questioning by the Republicans when they come back. Let's just give you a taste of what Dave Holmes said. He talked about realizing that there was basically a different type of policy that was happening with Ukraine. Let's go ahead and listen to what he had to say.
Beginning in March 2019, the situation at the embassy and in Ukraine changed dramatically. Specifically, the three priorities of security, economy, and justice, and our support for Ukrainian democratic resistance to Russian aggression became overshadowed by a political agenda promoted by former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani and a cadre of officials operating with a direct channel to the White House.
Okay, we'll be speaking to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, in a moment. First, let's get to Heidi Jo Castro, who is outside the chambers, where, Heidi, I think the top line, and I think you would probably agree, is Dr. Fiona Hill, basically with a warning to the committee about what Russia's goals have been, about how they are still being effective and what their goals are, which is to delegitimize the U.S. presidency. That's what she said. And also testimony from Mr. Holmes about basically how the official policy of the U.S. towards Ukraine had basically been hijacked, for lack of a better word. What else did you hear?
That's right. And Hill, Dr. Hill really put this in the big picture context of all of this. And warning, as you said, is a great description of how she phrased this. She said specifically to the committee members, she said, Russia is watching, and the things being discussed in these hearings, the partisan ways that these questions are being phrased, in particular, trying to highlight these debunked conspiracy theories that Ukraine somehow was involved in election meddling in 2016. She said that plays right into Russia's hand, and that what's happening now is her worst fear, that Russia had sowed this discord within the two political parties in the U.S., and that Russia may be using what's said now as ammunition into further election meddling in the year 2020. But that as far as the merits of this case the Democrats are trying to build for the possible impeachment of President Trump, it is the David Holmes, the Kiev embassy staffer, that's really delivering the bigger news on that front, because he was a witness to a phone call between the U.S. ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, and President Trump that occurred on July 26th. This is the day after Trump had spoken with the president of Ukraine on the phone, explicitly asking for investigations into Joe Biden. And just let me set the scene for this overheard call. So the day after Trump got off the phone with Zelensky, Holmes was meeting with Zelensky as a follow-up. He said that the president of Ukraine said 3 times that Trump had brought up sensitive information on this call. Sensitive issues were his words, that which he later understood meant these investigations into Biden. And then afterwards, as the U.S. officials were sitting down for a lunch, he was surprised, Holmes says, because Sondland, the ambassador to the EU, pulled out his phone, and in the middle of lunch on a patio restaurant in Kiev, he dialed the number for the president of the United States. And this is what Holmes said he overheard.
While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable, and Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it. adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do.
And Holmes put all of this into perspective as well. He said that beginning in early March, he felt that his work on behalf of U.S. policy toward Ukraine was being overshadowed by this shadow campaign led by the president's private attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Holmes also testified that he had a clear understanding that a visit for Zelensky, an Oval Office meeting with Trump, was conditioned on Ukraine delivering investigations into Biden. And then further, he said that it was also his clear impression that the security aid, $400 million from the U.S. to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia, he said was, quote, likely intended by Trump to pressure Ukraine to launch those investigations, which gets right to the heart of this impeachment inquiry, whether or not President Trump was withholding that aid for his own political gain.
You know, Heidi, one thing that the White House has consistently said, as have Republican members of this committee, they keep saying this is all hearsay. There's no one with the firsthand account. Of course, people that do have firsthand accounts, rather, the White House has forbidden them to testify. But David Holmes said that he realized, you know what, I do have a firsthand account. I heard this conversation, and it's pretty powerful what he said. I was there.
That's right. And he said that he had actually alerted his superiors at the embassy immediately after this conversation took place on the restaurant patio. And then in retrospect, as he was watching these hearings unfold and he heard Republicans attacking the inquiry, saying that all of this evidence was secondhand, that's when the light bulb went off in his head. And he said, well, actually, I have firsthand information. And he brought that back to the attention of his boss, Ambassador Bill Taylor, which is what got Holmes into the hot seat in the first place, bringing him to tell this story in person. And it begs the question, just how much more firsthand information is out there that investigators are simply unaware of? You know, could it be these lower level staffers that have that information, a possible smoking gun that still Republicans would argue has not been established to directly implicate the president? And perhaps the bigger question is, as you alluded to, Rochelle, is that there are certainly people who would know definitively what the president's thinking was on this, and they are the acting chief of staff of the White House and Ambassador John Bolton himself, and both of those individuals, and of course Rudy Giuliani, I should say. So those three individuals have all not complied with requests to tell their stories to these investigators.
Okay, Heidi Jo Castro live at Capitol Hill. Heidi, we'll come back to you. Right now, we're going to go to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, the testimony so far from Russia expert Dr. Fiona Hill, I think could be described as really a stark warning. She laid out what she says the goals of Russia have been, what she says they still are, and how this relates to Ukraine and to the U.S. presidency. She said that Russia wants to delegitimize the U.S. presidency, regardless of who would have been the president, and that they want to paint Ukraine in a bad light because the goal is to drive a wedge between the U.S. and its allies. It seems that Russia, at least from what we can see, has been effective in that regard. How do you think that this will be received by the White House?
Well, I think the headline here from Dr. Fiona Hill's testimony is not only sort of her expertise, but the swipe that she took at the president. She was very clear in denouncing what she says is a false narrative that she believes has been perpetuated by President Trump and also by some members of the committee, namely the Republicans. She, in fact, at one point, which was particularly powerful, spoke to Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee, accusing them of promoting politically driven falsehoods, I believe is the phrase she used, for domestic political purposes. In essence, what she's saying is that they have been perpetuating sort of an argument that has been put forward by what she says are Russian security services that Ukraine, in fact, meddled in the 2016 U.S. election when the United States, from multiple security services and multiple tiers of the U.S. government, has conclusively proven that it was Russia that meddled in the 2016 U.S. election. election. She goes even further to really issue a very stark warning that it is dangerous to perpetuate this narrative because she says that Russia's prepared to act again in 2020.
Right now, Russia's security services and their proxies have geared up to repeat their interference in the 2020 election. We are running out of time to stop them. In the course of this investigation, I would ask that you please not promote politically driven falsehoods that so clearly advance Russian interests.
So what really she's saying here, and she's taking a direct swipe at President Trump, is that for domestic political purposes, you have to remember the background of all of this, Rochelle, was when the president was being investigated for potential collusion between his campaign in 2016 and Russia. So he would very much have an interest in perpetuating, along with Republican allies, the notion that perhaps it was Ukraine that was actually involved. So this is somebody with expertise at the highest levels of the U.S. government countering the president directly.
And she also said, Kimberly, that President Trump did dismiss the expert advice that he got that made it clear that Russia was responsible for meddling in the U.S. election. And Kimberly, if we go back to Helsinki, when President Trump was up there at a podium with Vladimir Putin, he has said publicly, he has disparaged the intelligence community publicly. And it seems that what Dr. Fiona Hill is saying is this is dangerous and it's still happening.
Yeah, and there's no question that that is something that already the United States seems underprepared for moving forward to the 2020 U.S. elections. But sort of looking on the spotlight of today and the president's actions, as we saw last week, as we've seen even in the last few hours, this is a president that defends himself directly in real time. And we saw the president in advance of these hearings and even during these hearings, once again, tweeting repeatedly in his defense. One of the latest tweets, he, in fact, tried to discredit some of the testimony coming from the Foreign Service officer, David Holmes, trying to say that he doesn't have these types of conversations that have been characterized as being very loud. We heard from not only the Ambassador Sondland the day previously, but also today about these telephone calls, the president injecting himself into the testimony here. We also had him characterizing the Democrats as human scum, calling these hearings the most unfair in American history. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would be associated with the ugly word impeachment. But that is exactly what is happening right now. These are impeachment inquiry investigations. Soon there will be a vote in the House of Representatives, then later a trial in the U.S. Senate. That is exactly what's going on. But we see this president continuing to fight back, even in the face of very damning testimony.
Okay, Kimberly Halkett from the White House. Kimberly, we'll get back to you. Let's talk a little bit more about the testimony of David Holmes, the Foreign Service officer who actually worked at the embassy in Ukraine. He testified about when it became clear to him that the so-called Three Amigos, of course, led by Ambassador Sondland, the ambassador to the EU. He testified yesterday. He was also in charge of Ukraine policy, which seemed to be something that threw Mr. Holmes. And here's the moment he realized that they were running Ukraine policy.
Well, Ambassador Sondland's mandate as the accredited ambassador to the European Union did not cover individual member states, let alone non-member countries like Ukraine. He made clear that he had direct and frequent access to President Trump and Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, and portrayed himself as the conduit to the President and Mr. Mulvaney for this group. Secretary Perry, Ambassador Sondland, and Ambassador Volker later styled themselves the Three Amigos and made clear they would take the lead on coordinating our policy and engagement with the Zelensky administration.
Robinson Woodward Burns is assistant professor of the Department of Political Science at Howard University. He is in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your time. So what Mr. Holmes described there, this basically shadow U.S. policy in regards to Ukraine, is that normal?
That is not normal. There are a few points Mr. Holmes made that suggested that this is unusual. One is what we just heard, that Gordon Sondland was acting outside of his normal jurisdiction, effectively taking more interest in Ukraine than a normal ambassador to the European Union would. Another point we see is the so-called three amigos, at the center of which was Mr. Sondland, but also Secretary Perry, acting in ways to advance President Trump's personal interests, Mr. Holmes has suggested, rather than consistent U.S. foreign policy interests towards Ukraine that Mr. Holmes and the American delegation had been advancing prior to Mr. Sondland's involvement.
And in fact, let me get this here. Mr. Holmes described official U.S. policy in regards to Ukraine to be promoting peace, economic growth, and anti-corruption. So that's what he and the other staff were working towards. And at one point, Chairman Schiff trying to juxtapose that, the fact that on the surface, the U.S. is supposed to be fighting anti-corruption, but that seemed to be at odds with Rudy Giuliani promoting the personal interests of the president. How does that undermine policy?
What Mr. Holmes and to some degree Dr. Hill pointed out is that Rudy Giuliani was urging Ukrainians to investigate Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, which both Mr. Holmes and Dr. Hill suggested was done for political reasons. This was seen as sort of derailing American foreign policy making. Ambassador Yovanovitch was removed, it seems, at the behest of Mr. Giuliani, in part because she was seen as an obstacle to the investigation that Giuliani and Sondland wanted. One thing that came out of Sondland's testimony yesterday that's particularly damning is suggesting that a number of White House staffers knew about this sort of shadow foreign policy effort and were involved in it, including Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney, but also Secretary of State Pompeo and the Vice President and the President himself. That's pretty damning and serious.
Okay, so what has been testified, what the testimony that has come out is that there was this quid pro quo. Multiple witnesses have said this, that President Zelensky would not get a meeting at the White House with President Trump, and aid would not be released if he did not make an announcement, not necessarily actually make an investigation, but make an announcement about an investigation into the company Burisma and the Bidens. And let's break that down a little bit. So this aid had actually been approved by Congress. Even having said that, a president has a lot of latitude when it comes to foreign policy. Was he really was he within his rights to hold aid that had already been approved?
So the president has wide foreign policy authority and for a long time has. The concern is why the president would withhold this. And it's, again, that justification that makes all the difference. $391 million for Javelin anti-tank missiles was promised by Congress to Ukraine. And what these hearings are pointing out is that this shadow foreign policy then took that promised aid and made it contingent on a public announcement by evidently Ukrainian President Zelensky that there would be an investigation into Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. That's the part that's a bit unorthodox.
I was struck by something that Russia expert Dr. Fiona Hill said. She said the impact of the successful 2016 Russian campaign remains evident today. She's speaking of the Russian campaign, their goal to interfere in the U.S. election. She says, our nation is being torn apart. Truth is questioned. Our highly professional and expert career foreign service is being undermined. Is what she's saying on display right now?
One thing that's come out of this is that there are a series of career foreign service officers, Mr. Holmes today, Dr. Hill, and also people like Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman, dedicated members of the armed services and intelligence operations that are pretty unnerved by the Trump administration's evident attempt to run a shadow foreign policy in opposition to sort of American foreign policy goals. So that's one thing that came out. Another thing that Dr. Hill pointed out is that this effort by Donald Trump essentially to adopt a Russian-initiated and now discredited conspiracy theory of Ukrainian intervention in the 2016 election continues to undermine foreign policy. Again, Trump's sort of repetition of these debunked Russian claims Dr. Hill is worried is undermining not only American foreign policy towards Ukraine, but also domestically the security of American elections and domestic policy generally.
That's pretty weighty stuff. I mean, we're describing the U.S. president basically using Russian talking points. How concerning is that?
Dr. Hill said something to that effect. She wanted to sort of dispel any partisan ideas that Trump is, say, a Russian puppet or giving direct Russian talking points. What she said instead is that while Trump had sort of adopted these theories, it's not clear that he is operating on behalf of Russian foreign policy. She doesn't want to make those kinds of allegations, but merely to point out that in sort of derailing U.S. foreign policy by chasing these theories peddled by Russia, he has sort of affected foreign policy in a negative way. So it's not quite that she's saying he's operating on behalf of Russia,
again,
but rather that Russia has derailed him.
Not necessarily saying that he's doing it because they are telling him to, but the effect is the same.
Right.
He's still repeating things that have been debunked by his own intelligence community.
He is doing that, and that has been the consistent message, and also essentially resisting findings from bipartisan findings from Senate Intelligence and from the House Democratic minority of the Intelligence Committee. And in that, Dr. Hill has pointed out he is undermining U.S. Essentially intelligence and congressional findings, yes.
Okay, Robinson Woodward Burns, stay close. We'll get back to you.